Ever heard that saying about a butterfly flapping its wings, way off in like Brazil and it causing a hurricane in Florida?
Yeah, the butterfly effect. Small actions, big, sometimes disastrous consequences.
Exactly. And today's deep dive is a perfect example of that. We're talking about the 1956 Suez Crisis. And let me tell you, the aftershocks of this one, they're still felt today.
Absolutely. This wasn't just some regional blip on the radar. It shook the whole world, had these huge geopolitical consequences, and honestly, it still shapes how things work in the Middle East, even now.
So to really grasp what went down, we need to rewind a bit, right? Set the stage. Picture the 1950s, the Suez Canal, this vital waterway, like the lifeline of global trade, is right at the center of it all.
It's the shortcut everyone wants, basically. Before that, ships had to sail all the way around Africa to get from the Middle East to Europe. Way more time, way more money. The Suez Canal, it changes everything.
And whoever controls the canal controls a lot of the world's oil flow, too.
Precisely. And for decades, that whoever was Great Britain and France, they were the big dogs, a holdover from their colonial empires. But the world was changing, and fast.
Right, this whole post-World War II era, empires are crumbling, these former colonies are fighting for their independence. Nationalism is on the rise.
And in Egypt, you've got this charismatic leader, Gamal Abdel Nasser. He wants to put Egypt back on the map, make it a power player, and he's got this ambitious plan, the Aswan High Dam project.
Now this dam, it's not just some vanity project, is it?
No way! This thing was supposed to be huge for Egypt, modernize their economy, irrigate tons of land, boost their whole nation. Problem is, these big dreams need big bucks, and Egypt wasn't exactly rolling in it.
So what's a leader with grand plans but empty pockets to do? Enter the Suez Canal.
Bingo! Nasser sees an opportunity. Nationalize the canal, kick out the Brits and the French, keep all the profits for Egypt, use it to fund his big dam project. Boom.
Bold move. But it's Egypt, right? Seems kind of local. So how does this blow up into a full-blown international crisis?
Well, that's where things get interesting. You see, on paper, it's about a canal and a dam. But underneath, you've got these global power dynamics shifting, former empires on edge, the rise of newly independent nations, and oh yeah, the Cold War simmering in the background.
Oh boy, the US and the Soviet Union always lurking, right?
Always. This seemingly local event in Egypt, it became this perfect storm that sucked everyone in and had consequences nobody could have predicted.
So Nasser, he's making a big statement here, right? This whole nationalization thing, it's about more than just money for a dam.
Oh, absolutely. This was about national pride, Egypt taking control of its own destiny, throwing off the shackles of colonialism. And this really resonated across the Arab world. Lots of folks had their own scores to settle with the old colonial powers.
Right. Egypt standing up and saying, we're in charge now. But how does this land with Britain and France?
Not well. Imagine you're used to being top dog, calling the shots, and suddenly someone swipes your favorite bone right out from under you. They were not happy campers.
To put it mildly.
They felt threatened, both economically, that canal was a cash cow, and in terms of their global prestige. Like, how dare this upstart nation challenge our authority?
And that's where things take this whole cloak and dagger turn, right?
Oh yeah, full-on spy thriller mode. They hatched this secret pact with Israel. And it's important to remember, Israel and Egypt, they had their own issues brewing at the time. So the deal was, Israel attacks Egypt, gives Britain and France an excuse to swoop in, all peacekeepers on the surface, and just like that, they're back in control of the canal.
Wow. Talk about adding fuel to the fire. This is getting seriously messy.
Big time. You've got 3 countries, each with their own agenda, all laser focused on this one strategically vital waterway. It's a recipe for disaster.
And just to make things even more interesting, there's another major player about to get dragged into this whole thing, the United States, led by President Eisenhower.
Ah, yes. The wild card.
So the U.S., they're watching this unfold from across the pond. What's their take on the whole Suez situation?
Well, remember, this is the Cold War. Everything gets filtered through that lens.
Right, the U.S. and the Soviet Union constantly trying to outmaneuver each other for global dominance.
Exactly. And the Middle East, with all that oil and its strategic importance, it's prime real estate in this Cold War chess match. The last thing the U.S. wants is for this regional conflict to spiral out of control and give the Soviets an advantage.
So they need to tread carefully. but at the same time can't alienate their allies, Britain and France.
A classic dilemma. Eisenhower's in a bind. He wants to build bridges with newly independent nations like Egypt, keep them from drifting into the Soviet orbit.
Playing the long game.
Exactly, but he also doesn't want to completely throw their traditional allies under the bus. It's a tough balancing act.
So what happens? How does the U.S. react when things actually kick off in the Suez?
Well, that's where things get really interesting and more than a little awkward. Because, you see, Britain and France, they've been so sneaky with their secret plans that they kind of forgot to tell the U.S. what they were up to. Yeah, oops is one way to put it. When the invasion actually happened, the U.S. was blindsided. Not exactly the best way to treat your supposed allies.
A diplomatic nightmare.
You could say that again. And it wasn't just embarrassing for the U.S. It was a massive miscalculation on everyone's part, with consequences nobody could have foreseen.
So it's October 1956, and things, they go boom, right? Britain, France, Israel, they launch their attack.
Yeah, and initially it seemed like they had everything under control, mission accomplished, but then...
The world kind of stepped in and said, not so fast.
Pretty much. Remember how the U.S. was totally left in the dark about this whole scheme?
Oh yeah, big time.
Eisenhower, he was furious, He saw this as this blatant grab for power, like a blast from the colonial past and a huge betrayal by his supposed allies.
I bet that went over well across the dinner table.
Not so much. The U.S., they hit Britain and France with everything they had: sanctions, diplomatic pressure. They even threatened to pull support for the British pound.
Which, after the war, was already on shaky ground.
Exactly. It was a big deal. Basically, the U.S. drew a line in the sand, told their allies, "You're on your own with this one, guys."
Wow. So the U.S. is out. But it gets even wilder, right? Because then the Soviet Union gets involved.
Right. And this is where it gets really interesting, because here you have the two superpowers, the U.S. and the USSR, usually at each other's throats. But on this, they actually agreed. Both condemned the invasion.
Talk about strange bedfellows.
Right. The Soviets even threatened to jump in on Egypt's side, which, could have spiraled into a whole other world war situation. It was a tense time.
Yeah, that's putting it mildly, so everyone's freaking out. But this whole Suez situation, it did more than just put everyone on edge, didn't it? It kind of marked a turning point.
Absolutely. See, up until then, these old colonial powers, they were used to calling the shots, throwing their weight around. The Suez Crisis, it showed them the world had moved on. This wasn't their game anymore.
And it wasn't just a loss for Britain and France on the world stage, right?
Right.
It also hit them where it hurt public opinion.
Totally. Remember, this is just after World War II. People, they were exhausted by war. They'd had enough of empires and their power games. The Suez Crisis, it just became this symbol of everything wrong with that old world order.
A global PR nightmare.
Pretty much. And meanwhile, Nasser. He comes out of this looking like a rock star. He stood up to these major powers, defied the West, and even though Egypt's military, they weren't as strong, he still came out on top.
He becomes this symbol of Arab nationalism, right?
Exactly. His reputation, it skyrocketed across the Arab world. People saw him as a hero, someone who finally stood up to the old guard.
So let's fast forward a bit. It's been, over 60 years since the Suez Crisis, so why should we still care about it today?
Well, for starters, it shows how these seemingly small events, like a country nationalizing a canal, can snowball into these huge, unpredictable global crises.
The butterfly effect in action.
Exactly. And it highlights how these power struggles, these miscalculations, they can have these unintended consequences that echo for generations. We're still dealing with the fallout from the Suez Crisis in the Middle East today.
So it's a history lesson, but it's also a cautionary tale, right?
Absolutely. It reminds us that the world, it's a complex web of interconnectedness. What happens in one corner of the globe can ripple outward, impacting everyone. And that's as true today as it was back in 1956.
And that is our deep dive into the Suez Crisis. Hopefully it's given you a better understanding of this key historical event. It really makes you think about those what-if moments, right?
It really does.
Until next time, keep those brainwaves buzzing, folks, and we'll catch you on our next deep dive.
Ever heard that saying? Something about how a butterfly flapping its wings can cause a hurricane halfway across the world?
Oh yeah, the butterfly effect.
Exactly. And that's what we're diving into today, how these tiny moments, almost invisible decisions, might have completely reshaped the Middle East. We're talking about the Six-Day War.
Fascinating period, really, because, it's tempting to look back and think, oh, this was bound to happen, but the Six-Day War, it was anything but a sure thing.
Right. It wasn't just some spontaneous explosion, was it?
Not at all. Decades, we're talking decades of Simmering tensions, broken treaties, missed opportunities for peace. All of that's the backdrop to this whole conflict.
So before we even get to 67, paint us a picture. What was the relationship like between Israel and its neighbors?
Imagine a powder keg. Okay? That's what the Middle East was in the years leading up to the war.
Volatile.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And a lot of this tension, it stems all the way back to the 1948 Arab-Israeli War.
Yeah.
Right when Israel declared independence.
Huge moment.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But that victory, it came at a cost. Deep scars, resentment in the Arab world, it lingered.
I feel like that first crack in a dam, right?
Yeah.
The pressure just keeps building.
Perfect analogy. Now, fast forward to 1967, we meet Gamal Abdel Nasser, Egypt's leader, charismatic guy. He makes what seems like a small move, but whoa, it lights the fuse.
This is where the butterfly effect really takes off.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
May 1967, Nasser closes the Straits of Tiran to Israeli ships.
Okay, and for those of us who aren't experts in Middle Eastern geography, why was that such a big deal?
Right, so picture this. The Straits of Tiran is this narrow passageway, right? Controls access to Israel's southern port, Eilat, vital for trade.
Their lifeline.
Exactly. So close that off, and suddenly Israel's in a tight spot, economically vulnerable, dependent on a nation that's, shall we say, not their biggest fan.
More than an inconvenience, it was a statement.
Absolutely. And you know what's interesting? Nasser himself, some historians argue, he didn't even fully grasp what he'd set in motion.
You're kidding. He didn't intend for all-out war.
It's debated, of course, but some say he saw it as a gamble, a bluff even, to try and call Israel's bluff. Didn't necessarily want full-blown conflict, but by pushing, he may have accidentally nudged the whole region closer to the brink.
So you've got this incredibly tense standoff, and then Nasser, he raises the stakes even higher, doesn't he?
Oh, absolutely. Closing the straits was just the beginning. He starts moving troops into the Sinai Peninsula, right on Israel's doorstep. And to really turn up the heat, he kicks out the UN peacekeepers, the guys who were supposed to be there keeping a lid on things.
Wow. Talk about upping the ante. At that point, did people feel like war was a certainty? Or were there still doors open for peace that just, I don't know, maybe I'd overlooked?
That's the question, isn't it? The what if that keeps historians up at night. Could diplomacy have found a way through? We can't say for sure. But what we do know is that both sides, they were locked in, convinced the other was about to strike.
Like a pair of gunslingers in an old Western.
Exactly. You know that feeling when you can just tell a fight's about to break out? It's electric, right? That's the kind of energy we're talking about, but on a massive international scale. Every move amplified 1,000-fold. And back in Israel itself, well, their government was having some pretty intense debates about what to do.
I bet. What was the feeling like there?
Prime Minister Levi Eshkol, he was urging caution, trying to keep things cool-headed. But then you have his defense minister, Moshe Dayan, a whole different story.
This is where personalities really come into play, right? Not just policies on paper, but the people calling the shots.
100%.
Yeah.
Dayan was, well, he was a legend. Military hero, firm believer that Israel couldn't afford to just sit and wait for Nasser to make the next move.
So he was the one pushing for action.
He saw a preemptive strike as the only way to guarantee Israel's safety. Now, whether you agree with that assessment or not, that's a whole other discussion. But Dayan's personality, his influence, it carried a lot of weight. That decision to go on the offensive, seize the moment. Well, it was another one of those butterfly moments, the kind that echo through history.
Okay, so let's recap. We've got Nasser closing the straits, mobilizing his troops, maybe not totally aware of the dominoes he's toppling. And in Israel, you've got this internal struggle, caution versus aggression, and Dayan's voice, it ends up winning out. And that's when the other shoe drops. June 5th, 1967, Operation Focus. For our listeners who've been following this chain of events, this cascade of decisions, what happens next?
It's a whirlwind. Imagine yourself back then. No 24-hour news cycle, word of mouth, crackling radios. Israel launches these surprise attacks on Egyptian airfield.
Bold move.
Incredibly. They cripple Egypt's air force before they can even scramble to respond. This wasn't just a border clash. This was a full-on, we strike first kind of operation.
Huge gamble, wasn't it?
It was. But it paid off, in the short term at least. And then the whole thing snowballs. Jordan and Syria, they get pulled in alongside Egypt.
Hold on, more countries. How did that happen?
Well, that's another one of those butterfly effects we've been talking about.
Okay, so walk us through it. Jordan, they weren't part of the initial conflict, were they?
King Hussein, he's in a tight spot. He's getting pressure, right? His Arab allies, they want a united front against Israel. And on top of that, he's getting bad intel. Rumors flying around that Egypt's actually winning the war.
Wow.
Turns out it's completely false. But in the heat of the moment, It pushes Hussein over the edge, he commits his forces, and, well, classic case of misinformation having huge consequences.
It's almost Shakespearean, isn't it? The weight of those decisions. Had he resisted, if he'd had accurate information, who knows what might have happened?
Exactly. Some historians say if Hussein had stayed out, Jordan might have held on to the West Bank, East Jerusalem.